Welcome back to the Hardware Unboxed podcast for episode 79. Joining us today is Daniel Owen, one of the best up-and-coming PC hardware YouTubers. He's been making content since 2020, I believe, and has rapidly grown his self-titled channel to over 250,000 subscribers through timely coverage of hot topics, high-quality benchmarking, and lots of what I think is pretty approachable side-by-side comparisons. One of the things that we really love about Daniel's content is his viewer-focused approach, strong consumer advocacy, and like us, not afraid to call out some companies for bad practices. So you should check out Daniel's channel when you get the chance. It's titled Daniel Owen. Search for it on YouTube. But for now, I'm super excited to have a chat. So welcome to the podcast, Daniel.
All right. Happy to be here.
So how are things going over there? It turns out that for time zones, this is working out pretty well for us. I think you're based on the west coast of the US, if I'm right. So a bit of an evening shift for you, sort of the early morning for us here, or middle of the day for us here. So yeah,
made the kids some early dinner and they're watching a movie with mom. So hopefully that keeps the stomping footsteps to a minimum. If you've seen my channel, we know that is sometimes a feature. So anyway.
Some of the fans of your channel are quite familiar with how YouTube is sort of only a second job for you. You're also a full-time teacher, have a family. So I think this has worked out well for you, right? Because this is sort of summer break or something over in the US now, which kind of confuses me because it's winter here and it's very cold, but summer break over there. So you managed to make time for this, but how do you make time for YouTube in general when you're working a second job? You make a lot of content, so it must be pretty difficult.
Yeah, I'll let you know when I figure it out. So yeah, honestly, that's been kind of an ongoing process. Started the channel during the whole pandemic thing where I was actually teaching in video format because we weren't allowed into the buildings and all that. So while I was kind of buying some equipment to try to do a good job with that, I figured, you know what, I always was kind of interested in having a tech related channel. So let's just give that a go. Didn't think anybody would watch it, but here we are. But yeah, when it started to actually be successful, I was like, okay, well, I need to find the time to balance both of these things. And if we don't want the entire 90 minutes here to be used up with all of the various things I've been doing to try to make that work, I could maybe just go into a few of them. For example, it's really just about like trying to be absolutely efficient with any like kind of wasted time in the day. So for example, like a commute to work and back, I actually just bought a house last summer that is, I can walk from where I'm recording right now into my classroom in 2 minutes walk. I don't even need to get in a car. So I mean, that type of thing. I don't know if you can see it back there, but I got like a home gym set up. I used to spend, a decent amount of time in the gym. Don't have time for that, but I can go do a set of bench press and then do some benchmarking, all of that kind of stuff. So it's about efficiency with that. So I can get home from teaching before my wife and kids get home by an hour or two, and then since I beat them home, I can get a few hours of work in the day. Kind of get up early, work before they get home, and that kind of thing. But yeah, it's certainly something to manage, but finding all sorts of ways to make it happen. Just not a lot of wasted time scrolling mindless, doom scrolling social media and stuff. If anything, it's that's been replaced by scrolling tech news related sites to put together the GPU news videos and whatnot. So yeah, just making it work somehow.
Yeah, efficiency is a really great part of doing this. I think, back when I was in uni, which is when I started working at TechSpot, the predecessor to, well, TechSpot's still around, but that's where I worked before YouTube on Hardware Unboxed. Obviously not the same as teaching, but had to do a full degree while sort of doing reviews and that sort of thing. And that was a great way to learn how to be very efficient with time. And I think that's gone well for us as we've sort of moved over into doing, well, I do full-time YouTube. You've also been now doing sort of what I would think is 2 full-time jobs at the same time. But you need to be super efficient with that. So when did the passion for PC hardware start? Have you been building PCs for a while now, or is it something that's sort of come to you more recently since you started the channel in during the pandemic era?
I've definitely always gamed on PC since young kid in the early 90s. As far as actually building them myself, growing up, it was mostly like the family would buy some sort of a family computer that was, more of an office PC, work, school, that kind of thing. But I would maybe save up my allowance and chore money to get a graphics card to install in that PC. And
Mm.
actually, that reminds me of the first time trying to do that. So this was back when, if I wanted to be on the internet to look up how to do something, that would be on like the dial-up line, and my parents wouldn't
Yeah.
want that. So I remember trying to call my friend that was a couple years older than me and into PCs, that he'd done this before. And I'm like trying to explain, okay, I've opened up the case, that I think I know where to plug this in. Talk me through this, that kind of stuff. Certainly more efficient at changing out graphics cards now. Lots of practice. But yeah, definitely since the early '90s, growing up, always playing PC games and all that, and eventually had enough money to buy all the parts and build the whole thing myself.
Yeah, it's pretty similar here. Your story is sort of like, oh yeah, that's pretty much exactly what happened with me, right? Like exact same thing, family PC in the living room. I think I wanted to play like Lego Star Wars or maybe Star Wars Battlefront 2 back in the early 2000s. That desktop PC was far too slow to run that game, so I needed to get dad to come down to the local PC hardware store. Back in the days when people actually bought stuff in stores most of the time, you had all the graphics cards lined up with all the 3D graphical women on the boxes, which is kind of good. They don't do that as much anymore, but that was the thing back in the day. Picked out some ATI graphics card, I think, brought it home, could start playing Lego Star Wars. So yeah, that sort of started the journey for me. So that's always been fun. But so you've been a PC gamer for all these years. What sort of games do you enjoy the most? Is it like me with single player titles, more multiplayer sort of things, a mix of things?
Yeah, it's been a huge mix. If we're looking at my whole life, I've got to say that ever since having kids, I had to leave behind more of the competitive side of gaming. I always did a lot of single player gaming as well, but especially in high school, I was right at the age where, because I was also into console gaming. Halo, and then especially Halo 2, was like Xbox Live happened, and
Yeah.
we were all going to be pro gamers, and had to climb the leaderboard and all of that. So a huge part of my high school life was competitive gaming with Halo, and then moving on from that, I also on the PC side played StarCraft, and StarCraft 2 came out, was super into that. Transitioned from that into actually Hearthstone, and then actually managed to be, I know it's not the most competitive game in the world, but getting to the legend rank in the top couple thousand people in North America some
Oh,
seasons
nice.
and whatnot. And still like card games, mostly like Slay the Spire and stuff like that now. But so yeah, I've definitely had that kind of competitive side to gaming. Also got into some PC shooters and whatnot too. But I just found that after having kids, it's just you can get called out to just be needed at a moment's notice for any reason, and it's not a good thing to just be like, sorry, you're just going to have to deal with the kids screaming right now. I don't want to lose my rank in Counter-Strike. These games take an
Mm.
hour. This is important. Like that's not good family situation. So definitely been way more on the single player side of things since having kids, but have enjoyed both over the years. I mean, for big PC games growing up, I remember Heroes of Might and Magic 3. That was a huge amount of my time growing up. And then old Civilization games. I think like other
Yeah,
ones like that, like
nice.
Alpha Centauri, Sim City, all sorts of PC games. The first StarCraft and Brood Wars and all sorts of stuff. I remember trying to play Half-Life 2 on a graphics card that wasn't great when I bought it years before that. And you want to think about like graphics cards getting out. People think games aren't optimized, or your hardware from 6 years ago can't play games now. Try it in like the late '90s, early 2000s. Things were out of date instantly. So anyway, I play all sorts of stuff, but yeah, definitely less competitive than I used to be. Used to be quite into competitive stuff, but just don't have the time.
Well, fair enough. I mean, it at least gives you a very broad range of experience to sort of talk about these topics. Because every time I watch one of your videos, you always sound super knowledgeable about all the sorts of things that would actually matter to gamers playing the sorts of games. So I think that's sort of coming across in your content, which has been really good. So yeah, it's nice to just hear a little bit about your life before we talk about some, I guess, more main things that we wanted to chat about, sort of the current state of the market and things like that.
My
because,
childhood isn't the main topic of your podcast. I mean,
well,
I'm a little bit offended.
you'd be surprised how many questions we got asking about things like being a teacher, that sort of thing. We might get to some more of those because we do have some questions from our Discord chat to get through towards the end of the podcast. But yeah, lots of people are interested in your backstory and things like that as well. Now, across both of our channels, I think it's probably fair to say that we're not the hugest fans of this current GPU market, the current state of things. So, we've made lots of content talking about the sort of limited numbers of graphics cards that are worth recommending, obviously the issues with 8 GB GPUs as well. So I just want to hear your perspective. Like, what do you feel are sort of the biggest issues with GPUs at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, as far as the biggest problem, I think it's the stagnation in the affordable cards because, well, I'm sure, there's a bunch of people who watch enthusiast tech channels like this where they're like, $500 card is cheap and you should be buying some $1,000 thing or whatever. It's like the reality of the situation. And actually, maybe to go on to the teaching side of things, one thing about still teaching is like, some of my students are interested in, PC gaming and whatnot. And they'll ask me about that. And, their budget is sub $300, like they
Yeah.
don't have a ton of money to spend on this stuff. And it's just been really frustrating for that. I feel like the price to performance in that lower price range that I think a lot of people can actually afford just really hasn't seemed to get those huge generational increases like you used to get, years ago. I guess it's been kind of fading out for a while now, but and then now, this current generation with the 5060 was especially frustrating because it actually had a somewhat decent performance jump if you look at the raw performance, but then they just had to go and stick 8 GB on it again. And you're like, so it's like, I can almost recommend a $300 graphics card with this huge caveat. But, if you play stuff besides esports games, you like the AAA stuff, you're going to have to be battling the settings. And I think one of the issues with VRAM is that it's a more frustrating problem to have as the end user, especially if you're not like
Mm.
super knowledgeable about all of that. Because if a game is performing badly, if you can just say, well, your graphics card is too slow, lower the settings, like sometimes it's like it's stuttery, but you don't know why. Is this Unreal Engine 5 stutter I can't do anything about? Or is it stuttering because it's out of VRAM and people don't know how to, there's not some simple way to identify that issue if you're not like a YouTuber with an 8 and 16 GB 5060 Ti where you can get side by side footage. You're just kind of left on your own situation. So, yeah, I think for me, it's the stagnation on the more affordable products. It's been a long time kind of waiting for one where I can be like, yes, here's a great $300 or less graphics card. Everybody go out and buy this. You'll be super happy with it. No questions.
Yeah, I think there's been some element of sort of these companies kind of pulling the ladder up as they're sort of increased the popularity of PC gaming as more people, well, as they're making it more money from PC graphics cards in general. The 5090 is so expensive, but people are still buying them, that the entry point has now become $300. It used to not be that. $300 is sort of like a mid-range price point. So when someone had $300 to spend, it wasn't like they were stuck with whatever trash the companies had to give you at the bottom, because that was the $100 graphics cards or $150. But now, $300, you're encroaching on the price of an entire console, but just for a graphics card. Whereas again, like 6-7 years ago, $150 graphics card, you weren't really buying a PlayStation 4 or before that, like an Xbox 360 for $150. Those were always, around that $400 to $500 US mark. And so as that ladder has been pulled up and gamers are sort of feeling the pinch, they've, that entry point gets more expensive, but also the quality of those products has gotten worse. So $300 used to be mid-range, used to be reasonable. It would last you a good amount of time. Now, because it's an entry point, they're sort of manipulating the market with things like trying to upsell you by making sure that those graphics cards are never too good. Like there's always an incentive for you to get something better. Because I remember recently, I think it was last week's podcast, Steve and I were looking back at the performance of graphics cards like the RX 480. Like what could they actually do in games at the time that were launched in 2015 or thereabouts? And they were pretty good for 1080p, 1440p gaming. Now you weren't getting super high frame rates, But things like ultra settings, 50 to 60 FPS, 1440p was possible. They had enough VRAM. You weren't sort of doing what you were saying, having to figure out what's the actual limitation of the card. If it couldn't run the game, it was probably just because the GPU was too slow. But then today, like, yeah, you can sort of get the same performance with upscaling, but then you just run into titles where you have no real idea why your graphics card isn't playing those games. And so I'm sure you've seen a lot of, like, you've been testing a lot more recent games than we have. You get on those topics really quickly. But I'm sure you've seen a lot of complaints with those sort of like optimization side of things. Like, oh, surely this is the game's fault that I can't run this latest title. But actually, it could be because your graphics card doesn't have the hardware that it should have, and you just don't know that because you're assuming the overall product is too slow.
Yeah, it's just been frustrating in the low end. I don't even want to say low end because the way they're priced, it's like you feel like that should be a solid mid range card, but then it's just
Yeah.
feels like yeah. I think the upsell point you made there was a big thing. Yeah, it feels like they just keep wanting you to have a reason to spend another $100, but then oh, if you do, then the next one up, oh, you can spend another 100, now another 100. Feels like really until you hit like the 5070 Ti or something like that, where it's got at least 16 gigabytes of VRAM, it's got a lot of performance and all of that. Feels like you can kind of stop there. Like if you're looking at Nvidia's lineup, where it's like with the 5060, it's like, yeah, it doesn't really have a lot of VRAM. So you go up to the 5060 Ti 16 gigabyte. But if you're already spending that much, 5070 is just a bit more. And that's actually noticeably faster. But that's back to 12 gigabytes again. So now you better get the 5070 Ti. And now you're spending $800 on a graphics card. That's just, yeah, it's something going on there. Anyway.
Yeah, it certainly is frustrating because, again, like back 6 or 7 years ago, there were definitely incentives to buy higher end graphics cards, but that used to be unlocking additional tiers of performance. Like in the Pascal era, it was sort of the really early stages of high refresh rate monitors. Like we were just getting the 144 hertz models. G-Sync was introduced, I think, in about 2014 or 2015. So those are very new things. And so you'd buy a graphics card because you wanted to just have more performance. But if you didn't need more performance, the entry level models were totally fine. But again, today, like, it's very different. It'll be fine in some circumstances and not fine in others, which I don't think we've ever seen across the eras. So I guess, like, if you had to recommend one model to people right now, what would you say is like the graphics card that you could recommend to like a mainstream buyer, the masses? That's the GPU to get if you had to tell your friends who are not super into PC gaming or whatever. What sort of thing are you recommending?
So, yeah, man, limiting me to one model, that's a bit rough. I think if you're looking at the current lineups and not going like used market and all that kind of stuff, which I think, if you're talking just mainstream person, they just like, what can I order on Amazon or walk into Best Buy and grab? I think if somebody just has to be like, I think for some people, like going past $400 starts to feel like I'm making some major investment.
Yeah.
So if I'm kind of thinking, okay, what's something under $400 that can play pretty much anything that comes out, 1080p, 1440p mainstream resolutions, without some major issue caveat, I'd probably go with the 9060 XT 16 gigabytes. I know pricing worldwide is all over the place, but I know at least in the US, that's been right about $360. So I feel like that can actually feel like a reasonable amount of money for a lot of people looking to get into PC gaming, something like that. It's not, it's not more expensive than buying a PS5 or something like that as an alternative. Has 16 gigabytes of VRAM. FSR 4 does a good job with the upscaling. My only hesitation on that is just like, I really wish that you could rely on every new AAA release having FSR 4 support. I've talked on my channel about getting it like where, if it's a single player game that won't have anti-cheat or something, Optiscaler can mod FSR 4 into just about any game at this point. Although not always. Like I was trying it in what was it that just came out? Wuchang Fallen Feathers, and I was getting some crashing on it trying to use that. And other people were saying it was working for them though. But so that's where I get into again. So it's like I want a model that I can just recommend with no questions asked. And I feel like still there, it's like it's mostly no questions asked. But I really wish if FSR 4 support was just in every major AAA game launching since the cards came out, then it would be truly just like no caveats. Just get that, you'll be happy with it. It can do whatever you want. So if you do want to rely on more of the, I know I was supposed to only choose one model, but here we go. The 5060 Ti, 16 gigabytes. I don't hate, and it has come back down to $430 in the US market since the 9060 XT came out. I noticed before the 16 gigabyte 9060 XT was on the market, I was seeing the 5060 Ti 16 gigabytes much closer to $500. They were like 480 or so most of the times I would check. Whereas now I can usually find one or two models at 430 almost any given day at a major retailer. So, if you can go over the $400 mark, I would say maybe go with that. But one of those two, I think they're actually giving people good 1080p and 1440p performance with good feature sets. And I think most people could be happy with those without any major issues or anything.
Yeah, 100% agree with you on that one. It was, yeah, interesting. We published a video on Hardware Unboxed recently looking at the upscaling performance of those models. And yeah, at 1440p ultra settings, they're still quite capable GPUs if you're willing to use upscaling. And I guess what you're seeing a little bit in the market with like where those cards are priced, the AMD GPUs are where they are because of things like FSR4 is only in a certain set of games. If FSR was more competitive with DLSS on the game support list, then either you'd see AMD pricing their cards higher to sort of match more where NVIDIA is at, or NVIDIA would be forced to compete more with FSR. Because I think with that pricing difference, it will largely come down to, are you playing games with FSR4 support, in which case a 9060 XT makes a lot of sense for you, or maybe your favorite titles are DLSS 4 titles, in which case you'll have to spend that little bit more. But if there wasn't going to be as many people making that decision, then the pricing battle will be a little bit more favorable. So I think the stagnation part does come down a little bit to things like competition. NVIDIA's been able to accelerate with their features over the last couple of years, making them more and more compelling for people, which has allowed them to do things like pull the ladder up, make the mainstream models stagnate and more expensive. And now that AMD is coming back into having these high quality features, which we will be talking about in just a moment, I think that's going to make the whole market a lot more competitive, and people will feel like when they buy an AMD GPU, they're not getting sort of like the cheap option. They're getting a fully featured GPU that's got everything that people want. So I'm really interested in your thoughts on Optiscaler though, because it's something that we haven't looked at on Hardware Unboxed at all, because it's kind of, would you describe it as like a mod for games? Like it's not a first party tool, it's a third party tool that some people have made to add these features in. So how does it work, and does it work well?
Yeah, so it was something I just, as I said, my scrolling social media these days basically just, it's not social media. I'm looking at all the various, PC related subreddits and tech news sites and whatnot. And I had seen, shortly after FSR4 was out, somebody saying like, we got FSR4 working in Cyberpunk. And I was like, how? So, okay, Optiscaler, what is that? So yeah, it's on GitHub. You just download the zip folder off GitHub, and you just extract the files into the game folder where your main game executable is. And then there's a little Windows, like what is a batch file or whatever that you run, and it just sets it up for you. It really, once you've done it a couple of times, only takes like 30 seconds. And then for the most part, you just launch up the game, and you can press the insert key on your keyboard. That's the default hotkey, pops up a menu. And then what it essentially does is, if the game has to have either DLSS or XeSS or FSR support. And I doubt FSR1 would work. It would probably have to be at least FSR2, because it's going to then take, those all kind of use the same inputs from the game, at least is my understanding. I'm not a graphics programmer or anything, but that's my general understanding, is the game feeds them various types of inputs, motion vectors and whatnot, and they all kind of use the same basic stuff. But some games only implement one of them, like DLSS, or they implement, FSR3, but not FSR4, or whatever it is. So what Optiscaler does is it just takes those inputs and feeds them into the one you want to use. And you just have a little drop-down menu. You select the one you want to use, and it just uses that instead. And I like I said, I've pretty much just had games where it just works, and then games where it causes crashing issues for me. But when it does work, and the latest nightly builds seem to have really good compatibility, although, I can only test out so many games myself, but, comments I see in various places in my videos and whatnot seem to be saying support is looking pretty good. Like surprisingly, I haven't tested this myself. I've even seen some people say that on Linux, you can actually even force FSR4 to run on GPUs it's not supposed to run on, like the 7000
Mm,
series.
yeah.
I don't think it runs well because of I think there has to be some kind of emulation of the, what is it? FP8 or Int8 or I'm like I
Yeah.
said, not
Something like
graphics
that.
programmer guy myself. The point is that anyway, Optiscaler does a lot of cool stuff, but yeah, I think the basic use case for most people is this game doesn't have whatever upscaling solution I want, but it has one of the other ones. This can take those inputs and change them to the one that I want. And once you've done it a couple of times, it's really just like take my zip file I downloaded and just extract to my game folder and launch my game. Um, so it seems like a really cool tool. I think it's especially good for people with the AMD 9000 series to get FSR4 support in there. But it also can even do things like inject frame generation. Like I think FSR frame generation can be injected so that somebody with like a RTX 3000 series card, for example, they might want to use DLSS upscaling that might already be built into the game. But a lot of games don't offer FSR frame generation decoupled from the upscaler.
Yeah. Yep.
I think that was added with FSR 3.1, but
Yep.
earlier versions didn't have that. So you could do that where you can then turn on the FSR frame generation through Optiscaler even if you're using like the DLSS upscaling pathway. So there's uses beyond AMD's 9000 series, but I've just found that I think that's where it kind of blew up with people noticing it was, oh, I can put FSR4 in all the games I want it to be in, but it's not.
So is the quality that it produces, would you say it's like generally pretty similar to games that have FSR4 official support through AMD's sort of driver override? Because AMD say that they do some optimizations in specific titles so that when they whitelist the game in the driver, they've done some sort of work to make sure that it works well, runs well, gives image quality that they're happy with. Optiscaler, obviously, you can just do that with any game, so there's no quality control, so to speak. But based on your testing, have you sort of seen that, yeah, when I enable this in a game that's not supported, it actually looks just like FSR4 in a title like, I don't know, Assassin's Creed Shadows or one of those that has official support?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't done the exact type of head-to-head analysis that would be needed to definitively answer the question. This looks exactly the same as a native implementation. I think had I taken the time and thought ahead, like I know Cyberpunk, I think just had an FSR4 upgrade officially. Although I think the public driver for AMD doesn't support it yet. So maybe this is a place you could look into that. So I mean, the way to really test that out would be to test using it with Optiscaler before a game gets official FSR4 support, gather
Yeah.
some footage, and then side by side it after it gets it. But to be honest, I'm not sure that's super needed. It might be interesting. I can say that, for example, trying out Optiscaler before Cyberpunk had any kind of FSR4 implementation, you switch from FSR3 to FSR4 and you just instantly see a night and day difference.
Yeah.
It looks great. I've generally seen it just work well. The main issues I've seen with it have just been games crashing and things like that, where it just wasn't compatible in that sense. So it's definitely possible. AMD is doing some types of compatibility checks when they're deciding to whitelist driver support and things like that. That wouldn't surprise me. And Optiscaler, again, you're just kind of you try it out, see what happens, but yeah, image quality wise, I was really impressed with it. I don't see any issues with it. It's a night and day difference compared to FSR3 or any like TAAU. I was trying it Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, which has DLSS, and then TAAU from Unreal Engine 4, which looks awful.
Yep.
And that's no
Yeah.
XESS, no FSR. You kick on the FSR4 with Optiscaler and suddenly everything, it's like you put your glasses on. So I think image quality wise, looks great. Like I said, I don't know. I'm not a graphics programmer. I know that like with DLSS, there's various different presets they've released that all have slightly different tweaks that can add a little bit more, might have more ghosting on certain things, but other things look sharper. And so I don't know if AMD's whitelisting program maybe is helping select certain decisions like that behind the scenes, or if it's just a compatibility check or what. So like I said, I don't know. I imagine there is something more done behind the scenes beyond just like turn on the button and there you go. But yeah, Optiscaler does seem to generally produce very good image quality that I don't notice as being bad compared to what I usually see with FSR4 or anything like that.
Well, it's certainly a good feature to have because if your choice is between nothing and Optiscaler works in that game, it's a great feature to have. Yeah, and of course, with AMD saying like, oh, we do things to optimize FSR4 for a certain game, that might be more just we don't really know what they're doing there. It could be, as you say, very limited support just to make sure it works. And you sort of ham it up to make sure, oh, we're doing all this testing. That's why we don't have as many games or whatever. They can use that as an excuse. So have you sort of seen the quality difference between DLSS4 and FSR4 in general? Like, what are your thoughts overall about how these technologies are comparing right now? Is it something that you would sway more towards with a recommendation both games have DLSS and FSR support? Do you think it's a big decision factor anymore, or is it more sort of good enough for most people?
So I think you have to take that question two ways, which is one is the support side of things, like because
Mm,
DLSS is certainly still winning the game support list, especially if you're specifically looking at FSR4. And but then you can also take it from the image quality perspective. So FSR4 has done a amazing job mostly catching up to DLSS. I would say that they caught up to or surpassed DLSS 3, but NVIDIA launched DLSS 4, which was also a big step in image quality. So I would say now that if you had to rank them, image quality wise, DLSS 4 looks better than FSR 4, and FSR 4 looks similar or a little better than DLSS 3. But like I'm talking very nitpicky minor differences. Whereas previously, if you were looking at FSR2 or FSR3 compared to DLSS 3, for me, I think what it really matters is to the end user. Um, if I had the choice of I'm playing my game and I don't have enough performance, like that's what these are for, right? Like I want
yeah.
to have my game run faster. So I have a lot of ways to increase the performance. There's turning down more traditional graphic settings. So I could go from ultra to high to medium to low, or I could turn on an upscaler or both, some combination of that, right? And in previous versions of FSR with 2 and 3, I would say that usually I would choose to turn down graphic settings a lot before I would use FSR2 or FSR3 on either a 1080p or 1440p display. On a 4K display, FSR quality would often be pretty usable, but beyond that, I'd usually stay away, and it could be game dependent. Now, I'm particularly sensitive to a lot of image quality artifacting and things like that, and I know some people like don't even notice it; they don't care. And hey, more power to you. Your games will run faster, and you'll be happy. But whereas when I would game on an NVIDIA GPU with DLSS 3, when we were like DLSS 3 versus FSR 3, I would say that my number one thing I would do, my game's not running as fast as I want, I'm going to at least kick on DLSS quality. I usually can't tell much of an image quality difference, and my game runs a lot faster, and away I go. So it was kind of that. DLSS would be my first choice for getting more performance if I'm adjusting my graphics settings previously, and FSR would be more of a last resort. Whereas now, I think the big deal is that FSR 4 is at a point where, along with DLSS 3 and DLSS 4, it's more of a first choice for me. If I'm
Yeah.
got my game, I try it out at ultra settings, max everything out, see how it's running. If it's not running as fast as I like, the first thing I'm probably going to do is kick on DLSS or FSR4 or whatever, quality, and see if that solves my performance issues. Because then I've got the performance I need. Away I go. So it's got to the point where it is extremely usable, and that's where it needed to be. It's whereas previously the image quality, at least for a lot of people, myself included, it was more of a last resort rather than a first choice. And FSR4 could be now, in my opinion, a first choice for getting more performance with almost no loss to visual quality. I mean, now with both FSR4 and DLSS4, they're getting so good that compared to games like native TAA implementation, depending on how good that TAA implementation is, that like it used to be, I remember when DLSS first came out, there was all the like better than native stuff. And I'm like, yeah, maybe if you're standing still in certain
Mm,
situations, but with DLSS 4 and to a certain extent also FSR 4, there is some real arguments with it in many ways being better than a native TAA implementation. Obviously, upscaling is not going to be better than like a native DLAA or whatever. But yeah, I think FSR4 has moved to the image quality point where it can be a first choice if you're not getting the performance you need, rather than a last resort. And I think that's really what it needed to do, other than now get the game support going.
Yeah, I think one of the main issues with FSR3 and 2.2 era was how much of the screen was affected by the artifacting issues. Because if you're talking about, okay, what decision am I going to make to improve performance? A lot of games you turn it down from ultra to high, and some parts of the screen will be worse. Like you might get a little bit worse shadow quality. The shadows won't be quite as sharp, but you have to look at the shadows to see that. Or the volumetric clouds, they'll be slightly grainier or lower resolution. But you have to look there at that specific element to see that problem. But with FSR3, you turn it on and it kind of made the whole screen a bit more shimmery. And especially at those lower resolutions, could have made the whole screen more blurry. So no matter where you were looking, you sort of had those issues. Whereas with turning down the quality settings, it only impacted some parts of the screen, which I think is why you would have turned down, and why a lot of people would have turned down just ultra to even high or medium settings, because it didn't have those sort of ugly issues that were affecting a lot of the screen. Whereas it feels like in a lot of, at least my more recent FSR4 and DLSS4 content, when we sort of show artifacts like this is how they're getting more performance for you, it feels very nitpicky. Like we're sort of having to zoom in and look at very specific things. Like, oh, this wire gets more aliased when you go from native to quality down to performance mode. A lot of people don't notice those things. And it's one of the things that we've sort of, at least I've learned more recently, and this is coming about from testing the Switch 2 screen and chatting with people from Digital Foundry about, the issues with the motion blur on that screen, is that some gamers look at different parts of the screen while they're gaming. There are people that, let's say it's a third-person game with a character. Some people focus on the character in movement, but then some people don't look at the character and they focus more on the whole background area. So if people are looking at games in different ways, it makes a lot of sense that some people aren't going to notice these problems. Like if we're sort of showing, oh yeah, the hair quality is looking grainy in motion when you turn on upscaling, but then some gamer is not actually looking at the character at all while they're gaming, then they're just never going to see that problem. I think that's where these upscalers have helped a lot over time. How they've improved is it's made it harder and harder to notice the downgrades that they're doing, and having to look very closely at, oh yeah, this looks like that when you zoom in and run it at 20% speed or whatever. Whereas in real time, you're not going to notice those problems. But if we go back to some of our original DLSS content, even with DLSS 2 when it first came out, you could pretty clearly see issues in real time without having to do any sort of zooming or slow motion. A lot of those early games had ghosting issues or stability issues that you would just notice. And especially with FSR 2.2, for example, the stability is very obvious. Like you don't need, like I think there were some side-by-sides we did for our most recent content where it should be so obvious that you just immediately can tell. Like there's just that feel, that look that something's being degraded. Whereas as you say today, like you turn it on and it's good enough to play with. You don't feel like you're running at this lower render resolution, which has always been this issue with gaming at say 1080p, for example. It feels like you're no longer playing at 1080p with FSR2, but with FSR4, it still looks pretty good. It doesn't feel like you're degrading that entire gaming experience. And so, yeah, for me, first port of call. In fact, I think these days I don't even consider playing native really. I just turn on to quality immediately and just accept that I'm probably going to enjoy the higher performance more than sort of the native image quality. It depends on the game. Some games with a lot of like grass and foliage, I might turn up to native depending on the performance level. But overall, like I've been very satisfied with those features in general.
Yeah, I'd actually say I would yeah, oftentimes if I'm not already like capping out my monitor's refresh rate, kicking on at least quality level, DLSS or FSR, and really it would be more turn it on, and then if I start noticing any flickering or ghosting, try turning it off and seeing if that solves the problem. So it's almost more of like that's kind of my
Yeah.
default, and then I'll only consider turning it off if I actually notice any issues. Which, yeah, like I said, when DLSS 2 first came out, or let's not even talk about DLSS 1, yeah, that definitely was not the case. So, yeah, it's kind of interesting how it's all progressed over the years.
So do you turn on then frame generation by default, or are you much more of a sort of experiment with frame generation to see if it works in the game, or are you sort of a hater? Because Steve is probably more on the hater camp. I'm a bit neutral. Where do you sort of stand on it? And also, you've tested things like lossless scaling, which is again like sort of an Optiscaler thing that we haven't really touched on too much on the channel. And yeah, I'd love to get your thoughts on that as well.
Oh man, okay, frame generation. I just okay. It's so hard to talk about. So first of all, we could start with just yeah. So my personal gaming, do I turn on frame generation by default? And the answer is no. I very rarely in my own playing turn on frame generation. I am very sensitive to certain types of artifacting.
Yeah.
And I noticed that still, even with the latest versions, a quick camera pan, things look garbly, or if it cuts from one scene to the next scene, there's like a weird smear. I don't know. It's just, for me, that can kind of take me out of the immersive gaming experience. But I'm again, I have access to hardware that's already getting pretty good performance. That being said, I actually, speaking of still teaching, on my lunch breaks at work, I have a little mini PC that I reviewed, but I have the review sample with like a mobile RTX 4060 in it that I have on a 1440p monitor there. And I will play some games on that, even AAA stuff on my lunch breaks and things. And even then, though, I tend to not rely on frame generation. It's just a personal preference thing. But that being said, when reviewing it, I will try it out and say that I think a lot of people will prefer frame gen on to frame gen off. So I think it actually is overall something I'm positive about. I think it is a good thing that people have access to this. The parts that get more frustrating from the perspective not of being a gamer, but being of a hardware reviewer, a graphics card reviewer, is when frame generation tries to be passed off as raw performance. Because frame generation, speaking of, I mentioned I like card games, for example. One thing about like deck building and stuff like that is sometimes a card that seems really good is actually not one you should include because it's only good if you're already winning. It doesn't help you turn a lost game into a winning game. It just
Mm.
helps you win more if you're already in a winning position. And I kind of see frame generation from a similar perspective. It's uh, you already need your game to have a good level of performance so that input feels good, whatever good is to you. Now, this is also really hard from the reviewer's perspective because for some people, playing at 40 FPS feels perfectly responsive, and heck, maybe even 30 FPS feels perfectly responsive. And other people are, esports gamers that 200 FPS is it. I like anything lower than that, and I feel like it's a slideshow. So everybody's in a different place with that. But I think frame generation, since it not only doesn't improve responsiveness, but can even have a small negative impact to responsiveness, you need to already be at a good level of responsiveness before turning it on. And in addition to the responsiveness aspect, there's the image quality aspect, because since it's taking 2 frames and deciding what happened in between, then the farther apart those 2 frames are, it's going to have a harder time guessing what happened in between. So both from an image quality perspective and a responsiveness perspective, the it's better to be at a higher base frame rate initially. So when you're already at a high base frame rate, I think a lot of people will prefer turning it on in order to hit near their monitor's max refresh rate. And I think that's a good use case for it, and I'm glad it exists. And will occasionally use it in some games myself, although it's definitely not a just like I turn it on by default kind of situation. Whereas, yeah, I think with if when you try to call it performance, it's like, no, if I have a card that's getting 30 FPS in this game, and I get a card that gets 4 times that performance, that card will be getting 120 FPS in this game, and it's going to look great and it's going to feel amazingly responsive. But if I just take a card that's getting 30 FPS and turn on ×4 frame gen, and now my FPS counter says I'm getting 120 FPS, it still feels weird, and now my image looks all choppy. So it can't. It's not performance, but like I said, I do think it's a good thing, and I think that if a lot of people give an honest like A/B comparison, playing this game with frame gen on, playing this game with frame gen off, I think a lot of people will choose to play with it on.
Mm.
Which I think leads into I think the second part of that, which was lossless scaling. So lossless scaling is a third party app you can get on Steam for like $7 that can just add frame generation to almost any game out there, or even like videos and whatnot, just pretty much any window on your computer, I think. And the amount of people who absolutely love that, and some of them even love it from a 30 FPS based frame rate,
Mm,
means that, yeah, I think that a lot of people really do like frame generation, even if it's one that's coming from a third party app that doesn't have all the motion vector inputs and probably has even more latency. But a lot of people are really positive about it. So I do think that the general smoothness, so the people, like you said, like everybody kind of views things differently, right? So some people from gaming are primarily focused on that like input response, and frame gen
mm,
doesn't help with that. But I think some people, it might be the type of game you're playing or just how you perceive things, are looking for, I want really smooth, I want a lot of smoothness, and frame generation absolutely increases motion fluidity. Even from a low base frame rate, if you go from 30 frames a second to 60 frames per second, you do have more motion fluidity. Even if to me, I'm seeing all these weird warbly artifacts in the frames, but some people seem to prefer
yeah.
it with that for the fluidity.
I think it comes down to people who sort of have liked motion blur and those sort of things in the past, because I've always been someone that turns off motion blur, generally speaking, because I prefer to see the clarity of the frames. I want them to look at their best. And motion blur, all it really does is just adds a blur filter to the frames. So you're not seeing the high texture quality or the detail in the game. And of course, motion blur doesn't isn't really necessary when you're playing at a super high frame rate because there's just enough frames. It's already going to feel smooth. But if you're playing at 30 FPS, it can feel very choppy to use without that sort of smoothing technology. And so gamers that have always liked motion blur, and there are certainly lots of gamers that will play games with motion blur, especially console gamers where the 30 FPS experience is usually with pretty significant amounts of motion blur, but they like that because of the smoothness that it sort of kind of fakes for you with that technology. Frame generation is a much better version of that. Instead of just blurring everything, it really is trying to create a new frame that sort of looks similar to the frames that you've already seen. It's going to give you better clarity. And so for gamers that have really liked that sort of experience, it makes a lot of sense that they would appreciate frame generation. And there's people that do things like, play at locked frame rates because they want every frame to be consistently paced. They want that experience to be very consistent and smooth, as opposed to it chopping up and down between different frame rates. And those people as well, I feel, are going to have a good time with frame generation. But as you said, I think it's a really interesting perspective that you bring with the whole, is it taking you into a winning position, like from a losing position to a winning position, and how the marketing of it kind of implies that it can do that, but then the reality is that it can't. And so it was interesting seeing feedback from, say, our 4X frame generation videos, where I sort of said things like, this is really for people with those super high refresh rate monitors, like 320 hertz, 480 hertz, where you could take, an 80 FPS game, multiply that by 4, and you sort of up in those really high frame rates. But then that makes it a high-end feature. It's something that's not super accessible and is not super beneficial to people that don't have that high-end hardware. And so if you're starting from this position where you need a high-end GPU to already get good base frame rates, you need an expensive monitor to benefit the most from it, it goes from being this feature that's useful for everyone like DLSS to being something where, you need to be a super expensive high-end game that can afford everything. And that's just not the way it's marketed, which is, I think, disappointing. But if it was marketed as being this feature that, if you're a 5090 buyer, you might be playing a path tracing game. You're getting okay frame rates, but you've probably bought a 4K 240 hertz OLED monitor because you've already spent $2,000 on a GPU. You probably spent $1,000 on the monitor as well. And then that's where it gets the real benefits. So I play a lot of games on an OLED. If I'm sort of in that good base frame rate, it feels nice to use, and then I enable frame generation on an OLED because of how fast the transition times are, it can reduce some of that choppiness that an OLED can provide as opposed to an LCD, which has a bit more motion blur built into the way it works. And so it does improve the experience from that perspective. But it takes having a high-end hardware to begin with enough FPS, hertz headroom on the monitor to be able to do that. And I think another thing that comes into it as well is if you just start playing a game with frame generation enabled, you've never experienced it off, then you'll never really notice like the latency difference between, let's say, 60 FPS that's frame generated versus 60 FPS native. So if you just go in, when you first play a game, you're sort of figuring out how do the mechanics work? How does this game feel? If your only experience is with frame generation, it's always going to feel the way the game feels. And maybe for some games, you'd be like, yeah, this isn't a game for me, doesn't feel great. But for example, a lot of people, you just put them into Cyberpunk with frame generation on, that's their first experience, they'll be like, this is pretty good. But then if you manipulate the settings, you turn frame gen off, reduce, let's say use more DLSS upscaling or turn down the quality settings to get the same frame rate, they'll then go, oh, it's now getting the same smoothness, but it's also feeling better to control, to move around in the games. And so I guess, yeah, it's one of those things, right? Like your entire perspective on it comes from your use case and how you play the games. And I certainly don't begrudge people that sort of say, oh, I love driver-based frame generation. That, I would say blurs the UI of games in a lot of scenarios. But then those people are like, yeah, I love that feature. It's great. I love, enabling that on top of all these other things to get the most performance. And so it's always good to get a broad variety of opinions from people in the comments. It can sort of show you how a feature that I don't personally use heaps of is actually something that a lot of other people do enjoy using.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, speaking of like the driver-based frame gen and stuff, and that kind of goes with lossless scaling, where it's similar, where they don't have knowledge of what is a HUD element and what is not. So yeah, you get the blurring on the HUD. So I've covered those features a lot, and I generally in the videos say like, for me personally, I'm going to notice these HUD element things, and so I generally not going to use this, but I still want to test this out and show it to the viewers because I know. I mean, look at the comment section. A bunch of them absolutely love this stuff, and uh, also building on the that these technologies are best for those like super high refresh rate displays. That actually brings up something that's interesting that's in lossless scaling right now that so far AMD and NVIDIA haven't done, which is a really interesting frame gen mode that I'm wondering if eventually we'll get some like NVIDIA version or something. I think it's called an adaptive mode is I think what they call it, but you literally just type in whatever frame rate you're trying to hit and it will do its best to just output that many frames in a good pacing. But what's so strange about that is so far with everything AMD and NVIDIA have done, there's it's even multiples. So like I have 2 frames and I will use that to decide what happened in the exact middle. That's your normal times 2 frame generation mode. Or if you have times 3, I'm going to decide what happened at even intervals between these two, right? Or times 3. But at least my understanding of what lossless scaling is doing is using the real frames as its inputs, but I think is abandoning the idea that they have to even be output frames, where it just
Right,
generates whatever is time stamped. So you want 120 FPS? Okay, we'll just decide what should be happening at each of those intervals based on our input frames and just put it out on your display. And so, I'm kind of wondering if is that kind of going to be the end goal with frame generation from AMD and NVIDIA is just you turn on this button and whatever your monitor refresh rate is, the game runs at that. Just locked. And if
yeah.
it has to generate some number of frames to do that, it does. And maybe it lets go of the idea of what is or is not a real frame. The real frames are just the inputs. And I'm not saying that's a world I want to live in unless frame gen, or maybe I should say a feature that I would necessarily use unless the quality is good. Because again, with the DLSS upscaling, when that initially came out and, with like DLSS 1 and then even 2 was a lot better, but not perfect. Now we're at a point with DLSS 4 where it is oftentimes better than native TAA. Even if right now frame gen's not my favorite thing to use, I'm not opposed to it. I certainly see its appeal. And if it eventually reached a point where, the image quality was perfect and it could just hit my monitor's refresh rate and the input response felt good, then I'm not opposed to these things, being, researched and improved and all of that. Even if, yeah, for me, I will usually leave frame gen off, especially the driver level and lossless scaling and things like that. Since if it doesn't know what a HUD element is, they usually look pretty garbled. it just takes me out of the game.
Yeah, I don't use the driver-based or non-game-based versions at all because of that reason. But yeah, I think, the way NVIDIA is sort of talking about game rendering and moving past the whole, what is native sort of thing, I think we will see a future where every frame, or at least there's a mode you could enable where every frame is generated. And so it's just taking all of the inputs it's creating on the GPU, and it'll do some form of upscaling as well, because that is effectively doing that, right? The actual inputs to the upscaling algorithm isn't a nice looking frame. It's often a whole bunch of weird samples in different positions that then go into the algorithm. What's fed out is a frame you can actually understand what's going on. You can see how that could work over time as well, not just based on the pixels on the frame, but over time, and how it tries and goes, oh, okay, well, we've sort of generated these sort of things. We could sort of guess that at this time point and at this time point and at that time point, this is what the frame should look like. And then theoretically, it would look okay. But obviously, that would need to be backed by pretty good quality, frame interpolation or AI networks or whatever to make the frames look good. Because certainly, if you, for example, capture footage and you just happen to get the syncing wrong, so instead of showing all the real frames, you're only capturing the generated frames, and you just play that back. At times, it can look okay, but at times, especially with fast motion, it really does look very blurry and weird. And so that would have to be fixed for sure before they even attempt a feature like that. And obviously, dealing with things like the HUD is going to be quite difficult. They'd have to almost do like a separate overlay for that. I'm sure they're working on features like that. I guess this kind of goes in well with the next thing I wanted to talk about, which is, do you think that gamers are sort of buying the message of these companies when we're talking about, frame generation equaling real performance? I think that kind of worked at the start, maybe NVIDIA, when they were sort of introducing frame generation, people were willing to accept that message. But do you think now that we're sort of in the second iteration of that gamers are believing these claims, or are they sort of now more in a mindset to challenge them or dismiss them when they're brought up?
Yeah, I mean, there's the famous, 5070s 4090 performance with some vague, with the power of AI or whatever,
Yeah.
and obviously that's really talking about frame generation. And I mean, if you looked at comment sections and things after that, you definitely did have people taking that at face value when that was the keynote speech, that was the quote in all the big articles, and then later their benchmark graphs come out with a little footnote saying, but that wasn't even in part of the
Mm,
keynote. But I think that a majority of, at least, like, my audience that is obviously more in tune to this than the average, I just random PC gamer. I don't think everybody's watching tech videos daily, so I think that the more enthusiast audience is now looking out for those things and is aware of those things. I'm not sure the average random PC gamer uh, really even fully understands what frame generation is, or like, really, I think it's hard to answer a question like this. Like, are gamers seeing through this, when gamers is a really broad group, right?
yeah, for sure.
So I think there's the people who live and breathe tech videos, and for some reason they watch all my GPU reviews, even though they already have a GPU and aren't interested in buying the one I'm talking about today. I mean, thanks for watching, guys. But that's not the typical PC gamer, you know. Whereas, yeah, I really think, though, it's just occurring to me that, okay, but on the flip side of that, so if you're the person who doesn't pay much attention to this stuff, did you even hear the whole RTX 5070 as a 4090 claim in the first place? Honestly,
Mm,
probably not. You're probably not even thinking about, like, again, being a teacher, I get an interesting perspective because, again, my students who do have gaming PCs are interested in it, will talk to me about it sometimes because, they are aware of my channel. And but if I ask them stuff like, so what graphics card do you have? Oftentimes they can't even answer that question confidently. They don't even know what's in their
yeah. Yeah.
computer, let alone whether it supports frame generation or whatnot. So I think a lot of people in just the PC gamer broad demographic really just, they buy a PC at some point, or depending their age, their parents bought them one or whatever, and they just use that. And if it's not running their games well enough, then at some point they ask somebody they know, or try to find a YouTube video, hey, what should I buy? And that's where they start tuning into this kind of content, right? Where it's, hopefully, I think enough people are trying to call out the BS marketing, that hopefully the word is getting out to people. I certainly think more people are aware of it now than were when frame generation was first announced. Because I know I made, like, with the when frame gen was first announced with the 40 series, I think I had some video that was like the DLSS 3 problem, where I was trying to explain that, like, uh, I think what it comes down to is that FPS, for so long, your frames per second, has been the way we communicated how well a game is performing. But
Mm,
but FPS itself is actually measuring more than one thing. I mean, it's directly measuring how many frames are presented to the display, but that's generally before FrameGen was a thing, also talking about how fast your inputs are being processed and things like that. So, really, there's latency and there's motion fluidity. Frames per second is actually a measure of motion fluidity, but before FrameGen existed, it was also indirectly a measurement of responsiveness.
Mm.
And with the introduction of frame generation, we've now decoupled the motion fluidity from the input responsiveness. They're now two separate metrics. And frames per second, which shows up on the NVIDIA marketing slide using frame generation, I mean, that's not a lie. That many frames are being presented to the display, but it's just that those frames are no longer of equal quality to the ones you started with, and it's no longer increasing your responsiveness. So I think people had an idea of what 120 FPS gaming felt like. But if you now are achieving that through frame generation, it's no longer the same thing, right? But that doesn't mean you don't have 120 frames of motion fluidity, but it's just it feels different, right? So I think what it really comes down to is people are slowly, and it's still confusing, getting the idea that the frame rate the game is running at, as soon as you introduce frame generation, is no longer measuring both of the things you used to think it was measuring, right? It was indirectly
Yeah.
measuring responsiveness. It's no longer doing that. You can run separate metrics to monitor latency, but people are like, you ask the average person, like, how do you feel about your game having 30 milliseconds of response latency? They're gonna have absolutely no idea what you're talking about. Is that
Yeah.
good? Is that bad? You know, whereas most people have some idea of what 30 FPS feels like. And so I don't know when we'll get to a point where I could just show a latency measurement in milliseconds on a bar graph and somebody actually know, like, intuitively what that feels like. um,
Yeah. I
I don't
think
know.
I think at the start it's almost sort of an abuse of that position where your gamers sort of know what 30 FPS feels like. They know what 60 FPS feels like. And while NVIDIA isn't being inaccurate in saying that frame generation now outputs 120 FPS because it is creating 120 frames per second, but they're sort of using the sort of knowledge that people go, oh, but 120 FPS feels so good to play. And they're sort of manipulating that and twisting that to sort of for their own purposes, because there's while it is true that it's 120 FPS output, it's no longer meaning the thing that you think it means. And so there's this disconnect between what you think the advertising is saying and the sort of technical meaning of what the advertising is saying. And with that disconnect, you get people being misled, you get confusion. And yeah, I'm sure over time that will go away because, as you say, people will be more aware of the differences between FPS output and fluidity and the latency of games. But during that early period, it's very much this sort of, it feels very abusive. Like they're sort of, NVIDIA knows that people think 120 FPS means a certain thing, and they're sort of twisting that for their own benefit to sort of sell graphics cards to people. And only after gamers have gotten their hands on this feature and able to use it for themselves that they sort of realize that what they were sold isn't really what they thought it was, even if it's still, again, like a technically true claim that then it can't be sued over, which usually, is the threshold that these companies use for advertising things is, will we or won't we get sued for saying this? But for gamers, obviously, it means something different. And I guess over time, I think that is sort of changing a bit.
Yeah, I think, once I think I've noticed if you look at comment sections and things regarding frame generation, um, I think when it was exclusive to the 40 series and almost nobody had a 40 series GPU, um, I think most comments about frame generation were overwhelmingly negative, at least
Mm,
seeing it on my videos. Whereas I think once more people either got access to a 40 series GPU or a 50 series GPU, or got something like lossless scaling, or once AMD frame generation became available and you could use it on your whatever GPU you had, I noticed that, well, there are absolutely still people who are just overwhelmingly negative about frame generation. I think it's diminished in like the percentage of the comments I see about it. I think a lot of people are actually, like I said, a lot of people like to use frame generation. It's like it's never been that it's just this horrible thing and I'm so mad they invented it. It's just that I don't like, yeah, it's that changing the meaning of you hear 120 FPS and you imagine this amazingly fluid gaming experience. And I'm not saying that getting to 120 FPS with frame gen is even bad. I'm just saying it's not the same. And so, yeah, people just need to understand. I think once more people have experienced frame generation and you know what playing at 120 FPS with frame generation feels like, now maybe you have a more nuanced understanding of how to interpret that information.
Yeah, for sure.
And so I think people just having used it themselves helps them understand it. And I think a lot of people who use it themselves do end up enjoying it and using it. But I think also understand that if I achieved 120 FPS without frame gen, then that would feel even better. And then I could use frame gen to hit 200 FPS, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, so yeah, I think it's just one of those things where, as people just need time to experience what it is. And I do think that somehow some discussion of latency needs to be more mainstream the way frames per second is now. And I don't know how we get there, mostly because I think sometimes the tools for monitoring that and communicating that are a lot harder. FPS is a lot just easier to measure and communicate. So I don't know.
Yeah, that's certainly a challenge that as reviewers over time we'll have to sort of deal with. I do want to get your thoughts on this sort of last topic that I've got listed here before we get into some listener questions, which is about the sort of debate between game optimization and the hardware itself. Because you cover a lot of games when they're first coming out. You've just covered Wu-Chang Falling Feathers or Wu-Chang Falling Feathers. And obviously there's performance issues in that game. And there's been many games released over the years where people immediately cry, this game is poorly optimized, or there's something wrong that the developers have done that's making it run badly on the hardware that I have. Now, do you think that those cases are largely on the developers for not optimizing more, not putting in more time, money, effort to making them run well on the hardware people have? Or is it more of a hardware issue where gamers running these games should have better hardware, but they don't because the hardware is stagnated, as we were talking about earlier, or is too expensive? And maybe the game developers were planning for a future where hardware was better when they started making the game 5 years ago that just hasn't eventuated by the time it's come out. Of course, you could sit in the middle on that one as well, but it's something that we hear a lot about whenever we cover a video on a game, for example. Like, first thing people go to is poorly optimized game, let's leave a negative review, let's complain, especially if it's a sort of a developer people are primed to hate already, like a Ubisoft. So where do you sit on all of this?
Man, this is going to have to be a somewhat nuanced answer. I mean, the first thing I want to talk about is just that I feel like so many people use the word optimization incorrectly in these discussions. So yeah, talk about how like 120 FPS doesn't mean what you thought it does. I'm not sure optimization means what a lot of people use it to mean. I think that a lot of people say something's unoptimized if it isn't running fast on their hardware. And I don't think that's really what optimization should mean in this sense, because I think it's like, okay, whatever visual design target your game set out to hit, are you achieving that in an optimal way? Or is there a bunch of wasted resources and bad code going on in the background where you could have achieved this same overall look and had it run twice as fast or something like that? So I don't think it's fair when people call a game unoptimized if it's like max settings in some like boundary pushing game that just looks phenomenal. And let's not call Cyberpunk unoptimized because the path tracing mode is hard to run. Like if you play the game at medium settings, it still looks pretty good and can run on my Steam Deck,
Yeah.
So I just want to make sure people are using that word correctly, because I think that some people want to scream it's unoptimized if like it runs slowly at maximum settings. So I think, first of all, we have to measure if you tune optimal settings or go to a preset that's lower than ultra. Like it used to be the case that if you turn down to like medium or low graphic settings in a game, it would oftentimes just destroy the look of the game. Like there was a time where that would just turn off shadows completely and just like it looks like you're playing an entirely different game. The vast majority of games now, not necessarily all of them, but the vast majority of games now, medium settings versus ultra settings can be a subtle distinction in side-by-side footage. Like it's not that there is no difference, but oftentimes I think what's happening is to push like video game graphics are really good now. Like if you want to add more and more and more, there starts to be diminishing returns. Where if you look at like the history of games, it's like, going from like the Super Nintendo to the Nintendo 64, like we're moving from 2D sprites to like 3D. But then if you look at that 3D, it's like these models are ugly, the frame rates are low, and then every time you get a new console generation, there's these just massive, obvious visual improvements. But I think that one thing that's happened in the last decade or so is that game graphics have gotten good enough that the improvements that still take a lot more hardware resources to run and do offer subtle visual benefits are just less obvious. So, like
Mm,
games, you've probably seen a bunch of comments like games don't look any better than they did in 2016 or whatever. And they do, but like games in 2016 didn't necessarily look that bad. So it's like it's that they've gotten better, but there's no longer this like low hanging fruit of I'm going from like this vaguely human shaped blob to like a
yeah.
photorealistic human. So I think it's that games are continuing to push graphical boundaries, and it continues to demand more hardware, but the people don't, I think, see what they're getting for their money. I think that's part of the issue, and also trying to run them at the max settings. Oftentimes, you can turn down just a bit, and it will run a lot better. Now, that being said, I do think there's some games that are very poorly optimized out there, but I try to be really careful in my videos calling a game unoptimized. A lot of times, I will test its performance and present that information. People can then scream that that means it's unoptimized in the comment section, but I did call out like Monster Hunter Wilds, for example, where I felt like it didn't visually justify the kind of hardware it took to run it at a decent frame rate. And that's what I feel unoptimized actually is. It's like I can try turning down the settings, and it doesn't even look that great at max settings. It looks really bad at low settings. And even when it looks bad at low settings, it still doesn't run very well.
Yeah.
That's something that I'll call unoptimized. Now, is it the hardware's fault? Is it the game developer's fault? I think it's absolutely true that we're not getting the generational hardware uplifts that we did in the past. So I think that a lot of people, depending on their age, they might have gotten to PC gaming at a time where, like, if you were partway into like the PS4 generation, you could build a PC that's going to run at high frame rates at ultra settings in PS4 games. And you know, if you look at now, we're in the PS5 generation. If you want something that's significantly more powerful than a PS5, you're actually having to spend quite a bit of money to get a
Mm,
GPU that's like vastly more powerful than that to run at like 100 FPS, because the consoles aren't necessarily like shooting for that. So I think it's certainly the hardware slowdown in this most recent console generation. Um, I think has made it harder to, it doesn't feel the way it used to. Because I really do think that a lot of game development, if we want to get back to that side of it, again, I'm not a game developer, but my general impression is that a lot of game development targets its base visual design and all of that on the popular consoles like the PlayStation 5. So if that's their core target, and maybe that's what's equivalent to like medium to high settings on PC, and then you try to run it at ultra settings on PC and you want 100 frames per second, and the console's only shooting for like 60 FPS in like a performance mode that's running with a lot of upscaling, and its 30 FPS mode is the one that's actually running at a decent resolution. It's like, and look at the actual GPU horsepower in a PS5. Is your GPU actually that much more powerful than the PS5? So I think we're just I think it's just in a rough spot. We're just not getting the kind of generational uplifts we got relative to consoles by the same point in the console lifespan. And I think we're seeing that, in addition to some specific games genuinely being terribly optimized.
yeah, there's definitely poor examples, but I think a lot of people that we see in our comments, sort of they bring up these examples of quote unquote well optimized games in comparison to the poorly optimized games, but they're just totally different games. So, open world titles, for example, have always historically had lower performance for the same visual quality than a racing game, for example. So we used to see a lot back in the day, this sort of comparison between whatever the big open world title is at the time compared to like a Forza game. And it's like, well, Forza isn't really doing the same sorts of things in the game as an open world title, which has a much larger game world, has many NPCs doing complex things, and has a lot of things running, because obviously optimization can affect CPU performance as well, which isn't usually an issue in a racing game compared to an open world title. So that's one of the things that we often saw, which definitely applies to the sort of modern games. I think as well we're in this period where we are seeing diminishing returns with the I guess, techniques that we're using to render games at the moment. So for things like rasterization, we're sort of getting towards the end of what can feasibly be done with that. Now, you do see games that don't have ray tracing that look really good, and the developers have obviously put in a lot of work to make sure that the game looks amazing without needing to use ray tracing. But they're few and far between, and it's clearly those super high-end titles with a lot of budget that's going into them that they can optimize for that sort of scenario. And they're often games where maybe they don't have a dynamic time of day system, which is much harder to do with rasterization, looking, with the top-end sort of visual quality. So I think we're in this period where clearly at some point things like path tracing are going to be this next step up visually, where people are going to go, "Whoa, this does actually look quite a bit different to the games I'm used to playing. It looks a lot more realistic." But that requires such a significant leap in performance that we're just not there yet. So we're sort of in this intermediary period where, yeah, you're seeing largely these diminishing returns that you've been talking about compared to games from, say, a decade ago. But that's because we just don't have the hardware yet to do that next step. And it comes down to things like VRAM as well. Obviously, game developers could be putting in high quality textures if more VRAM was available, and that could give leaps in quality as well, more dense, more detailed game worlds. These are things that are expensive for game developers to do. So I think all that goes into it. And I think it's rare that we see today games which are sort of in that genuinely poorly optimized category, like a Monster Hunter Wilds. There's definitely a lot of games where, yeah, the ultra settings aren't amazing, but the game still runs really well and looks great on lower settings. I think of a game like Alan Wake 2, which is quite a difficult game to run at the higher settings, but the low settings in that game look better than a lot of games. I think low looks better than, say, a title from 10 years ago. Like if you go back and look at like a Far Cry 4, for example, and you compare that to Alan Wake 2 on low settings, Alan Wake 2 looks better. It looks more detailed. It's got more going on. And there's more advanced, animations, more advanced, levels of detail overall that our low settings may not be completely nerfing. Like you would have seen in Far Cry, turn down to low settings, like half the trees disappear. So yeah, we're sort of in that position where, again, I think it's that intermediary period where hopefully at some point we'll have this next generation hardware which will allow this big step in visual quality, but game developers have been quite hesitant to go all out on that just for now. So it's a difficult one. I think both sides of the camp, the game developers would like better hardware, the hardware manufacturers would like more work to be done to get their games running better. And so it's sort of a mixture of both things. So we've got some listener questions here. We've actually got a lot, so we'll see how many we can get through in how much time we've got left. But one of the first questions comes from our very own Steve here from Hardware Unboxed, and he wants to ask about VRAM testing. So how have you found VRAM focus testing? He says he finds it time-consuming, often difficult to nail down all the given variables. You often can't just run a standard 30 or 60-second benchmark pass, as VRAM-related issues can present after extended periods of gameplay. There's also the image quality issues that need to be analyzed. Personally, I think Daniel does a really good job with this sort of testing, some of the best on YouTube. So yeah, how have you found the sort of VRAM focus side of things?
Really annoying to test. I get the feeling in my comment section sometimes that they just must think that I love this because then you get to make more videos about VRAM's an issue in this game. It's like, no, honestly, testing this stuff is an absolute headache. The one thing that has made it somewhat approachable is having identical cards with different VRAM capacities, like the 5060 Ti 8 and 16 gigabyte models, where you can try to run an identical benchmark pass on both, show the side-by-side footage, look at things like the frame time graph for stutters, and look at the footage for texture differences. And that is extremely time-consuming. Fortunately, I guess for me is that my benchmark style is already head-to-head, side-by-side video footage comparison for the most part. So my normal benchmarking already includes capturing side-by-side footage. So it's not necessarily an additional step to look for things like different textures and stuff. That somewhat fit more naturally, I think, into what I do than it does in a more if you just do bar graphs, yeah, how do you show like missing textures in bar graphs? Now you have to go capture the footage. So it's somewhat
Mm.
fortunate to me that I'm already doing that as part of my process. But yeah, it's a real headache. And when it comes to the standard 30 to 60-second benchmark run doesn't necessarily capture it. Yeah, I mean, one thing I have to talk about in my videos is that I'm showing you what's probably a best case scenario for the lower VRAM capacity GPU, because quite frankly, I can't do a 2-hour gaming session side by side in every single one of these games at all the different settings. Whereas you using this might be playing 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours. I don't know. Some of you probably game all day and all night, whatever. And VRAM often fills up, or you enter a new location, and I can't test these games in all those new locations. So I will just agree that it is time consuming and difficult, and I don't make any claim that I've identified all of the issues that these various games might point out. And there's definitely stuff slipping through the cracks, but by capturing that side by side footage and trying to look for those things, and I can at least point out that literally like the bench games I set out to benchmark in my most recent set of games is just big releases of 2025. I didn't pick any of them knowing ahead of time that they had VRAM issues. It's just that the vast majority of them showed VRAM issues on 8 GB cards, even in 60-second benchmark runs.
Yeah.
When you looked at the side-by-side footage, it's just that we're at a point now where it's just getting so common that it's actually just getting easy to catch it in these shorter benchmark runs. But where that might be misleading, and I try to call out in my videos, is that this is the best case scenario, right? It's likely worse in longer runs, and I may have missed games that have a problem that just didn't show up in the method I was testing it. But
Yeah.
it's tough. I wish I didn't have to worry about it, honestly.
Yeah, and I think it helps when the community sort of points out certain games or areas within games that they're having issues with on their 8 GB cards. I think that's where we've found things like issues with Halo Infinite in the past, where it really does take like 30 minutes of gameplay to identify those issues in certain areas. And people can say in the comments things like, hey, I've been struggling to run this game in this area on these settings on my 8 GB card. Then we can go and investigate it. Because while I do play a fair few single player titles the whole way through, so at times we do have a good set of locations to look at, we don't test every single game that comes out. And certainly there are times where the most intensive part of a game is very late into the game's gameplay. And so it might be running fine in your 8 GB card up until a point where suddenly you reach that big city or whatever and it all falls apart and suddenly you can't enjoy the game anymore. So yeah, it really helps when the community sort of lets us know the specific areas, places that we can test and how long you need to test for until you find those issues, because that's how we found a lot of these games that we identify. At other times it is fairly obvious early on. You fire up like Indiana Jones, for example, and if you're trying to use the high quality ray tracing settings, the game will either just crash or not work immediately. So then that becomes very obvious. But as we sort of had to figure out, oh yeah, some games drop textures, but they'll only do it in certain locations or after certain times. It does mean that we can occasionally, especially because a lot of our testing is those benchmark charts, show the numbers, the 8 gig and 16 gig cards deliver the same FPS output. But then, it turns out that actually if you played for longer in a certain area, that isn't true. Or maybe it is true, the FPS is the same, but the quality is different. So it's certainly been hard from that perspective. Dan asks, which metrics weigh heaviest in your monthly best GPU lists? Is it dollars per FPS, power draw? Is it something different? So if people aren't familiar, you do monthly sort of, this is the GPU you should be buying content, which is really great. It's always up to date. There's always something you can go look at on Daniel's channel to get the buying advice right then for the month that you're buying. So yeah, how do you put those videos together?
So my general thought on those is that I try to think about how I think most people would buy a graphics card, or at least how I would, which is, I have this amount of money I'm willing to spend. So whatever that budget is. Now, everybody has a different answer to that number, right? So in those videos, they're mostly structured around, okay, let's look at a certain price point. If you have about $300 to spend on a graphics card, first, like I said, a lot of people don't pay a lot of attention to this stuff until they're about to buy something. They might not even know what the latest GPU generation is called. So, somebody tuning into one of these videos might have absolutely no idea about the GPU landscape. So I'm like, so let's start with, at this price point, here's the current graphics cards from the various manufacturers. And these are your options. Now, let me tell you my thoughts on which of these I would recommend over the other. If I do recommend one over the others, at some price points, I'm like, it's more about here's the pros and cons of each one. Decide which of those pro con lists more matches up to you. And so really there's not a specific thing like FPS per dollar. I think that's like, I mean, because I'm not looking at a whole lineup of GPUs and looking at which one has the best FPS per dollar if they're at completely different price points. I'm looking at two GPUs at roughly the same price because you have a certain budget in mind if you're buying. I know not everybody buys that away, but I think it's pretty common. And so it's more about, okay, here's what you could buy for this price. Now I might look at, does one offer significantly more raw performance than the other one does? Sometimes it does, and it comes down to that. This one's 30% faster by that. They cost the same. Whereas that's not always the case. So oftentimes at certain tiers, it's more like, so let's say you want the best GPU under $400. Okay, right now you'd be looking at the 9060 XT 16 gigabyte up against, well, under $400, actually at exactly $360 range. It's the 8 gigabyte 5060 Ti, not the 16 gigabyte version. So it's like, if you're spending under $400, I'm not going to tell you to get the 5060 Ti 8 gigabyte. At the same price, you get the 9060 XT 16 gigabyte. And sure, there's some pros and cons going the AMD route, but I think that having double the VRAM capacity over the 8 gigabyte card matters more, right? So it really just depends on the particular matchup I'm looking at that price point. Whereas sometimes you get into price points where there's less obvious distinguishing factors, or AMD doesn't even compete against a 5090, right? So then it's more like, is this much faster than the other stuff? Like if you have $2,000, is it worth spending that? So it's really just, I approach it very different based on what price point I'm looking at, and so I go price point by price point. Here's what's available. Here's what I think at between these specific graphics cards, which isn't always a raw performance difference.
Going to jump around a bit here to a question from Rand XL Thor, which I think is a really interesting question. I'm keen to hear your opinion on this one. As a teacher, what do you see the next generation of gamers looking like, and how does that compare to when you grew up? Do you think PC gaming and hardware will thrive? Will gaming just be smartphones and Nintendo Switches, or something in between?
Yeah. So, I get the general sense that there's actually more PC gaming, at least at the high school I teach at, than I remember with my gaming peers when I was in high school. There were very few other PC gamers at the high school I went to. So I would say there's more PC gaming now. And I would guess that that's probably related to the growth of like Twitch streaming and stuff like that, where oftentimes people are watching streamers who are playing on a high-end PC. Whereas when I was in high school, that just wasn't a thing. And there's a very good chance that, you had no idea what gaming PCs were, what kind of hardware you would need, how you would even do that. But, you know exactly what an Xbox or a PlayStation is, and you buy one of those. So I think that, yeah, with the growth of stuff like that, I think it's actually helped. My general impression, of course, this is anecdotal evidence, PC gaming be, more known to that age group than it was when I was that age. Now, overall, though, I think console gaming, on the other hand, might be kind of diminishing. I do kind of get the feeling that a lot of my students will either game on their phone, maybe a Switch, or maybe get into gaming PCs. And some definitely have consoles, but I do feel like, that the market share of those things is maybe consoles may be losing some of it to both ends of that. I think the more people who are into the gaming culture and watching Twitch streamers and all that might be excited about gaming PCs. Whereas the more casual gamers, it's like, why would I buy some expensive console with expensive console games when I can play games on my phone that are often free? And my parents bought me my phone, So,
yeah.
So yeah, I think that there could be a change there. Also, Rand Althor, I'm a huge Wheel of Time fan, so like your name there. Anyway.
So do you also see any differences in like the games that kids are interested in these days? Because I remember when I was growing up, there were multiplayer games that were super popular, like Halo, Call of Duty, those sort of games. But it also, me and my mates, same sort of thing. Not too many people interested in PCs in my school. Most people playing console games, but they were playing a lot of, like an Assassin's Creed, or GTA was obviously huge at the time. Those sorts of games, Far Cry, all those. These days it feels like a lot more, at least what I hear. I don't have kids, but I sort of get the impression that a lot of kids are just playing like the main multiplayer titles, like your Fortnite, obviously Roblox as well, those sorts of things. Are kids sort of getting interested in the games that we sort of would have grown up with, the big single player titles that sort of, maybe for more mature audiences, maybe they're made for adults these days, but are kids getting interested in those sort of things as well?
So again, being into statistics as a math teacher, got to say, I have a limited sample of my
Sure. Yeah.
classroom. But yeah, I definitely get the impression that um, multiplayer gaming is a social thing. It's very accepted. It's very popular, and so yeah, the multiplayer stuff, Call of Duty, Fortnite, all those types of games, those are big, um, and I think much more so than the AAA single player stuff. However, I do think there's definitely still gamers playing the big AAA single player stuff. And I'm actually just curious if it's a smaller percentage or whether actually just gaming is more mainstream in general. Because
Mm.
there's been a transition over time from gaming being kind of a small niche thing that was very like nerdy, stigmatized, and all of that, to now it's just absolutely mainstream. Everybody knows what you're talking about if you play Fortnite or Call of Duty, and the vast majority of my students have probably at least played it a little bit at some point in their life. Whereas, I think it's more still a certain niche that actually gets into the like AAA single player stuff, or even more niche single player stuff. Because I think that that's less of a social thing. I think that it's now just completely normal, just as a social thing, to just you get on Xbox Live or PlayStation, whatever, and play the multiplayer stuff with your friends. That's pretty big. But yeah, so I think people are still playing the single player stuff. But I think that might have remained maybe where it was, as it's a kind of a niche thing. Whereas I think maybe what's expanded more rapidly and been more just normalized as everybody does it is the social gaming. Maybe we'd say it with the more online stuff.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, you see that in a lot of other industries. Like you look at, the rise of things like movie and TV. It always starts with, movies come out, they're kind of a niche thing. People are trying to do their best to create, art using that medium. But eventually, as it becomes popular and mainstream, you get this sort of mainstream appeal that dominates most things that people watch. But then there's still that market for people creating, quote unquote, artistic movies or whatever, or, certain more things that don't have that broad appeal, like a Marvel movie or a Superman movie or something, but still do have an audience and people still want to watch that sort of content. It hasn't Those sort of movies haven't disappeared as Marvel has taken over. Now, I guess there's been even, I guess, more of a cultural shift these days with sort of, the decline of cinemas and things like that, that changes that discussion a little bit. But overall, people are still making some of those types of things that, are more adult focused and not necessarily the mass appeal sort of thing. So I think for gaming, that's hopefully it will continue to happen in that sort of way, that there is still this audience for single player games. And you can see that obviously a lot of single player games are very popular. They sell well, they make money. And so that's still a good sign for that aspect of PC gaming. And I guess in general as well, my parents, for example, never grew up as gamers. They don't game at all. But I would imagine that as both you and I age and get into that sort of age range, become 50, 60-year-olds, we're probably still going to continue thinking of gaming as something that we want to do older in life. And that's going to have, single player gaming is going to appeal to that sort of audience. And there's going to be a much broader range of people than there was when we were growing up, where my parents, who were in their 40s or whatever when I was a teenager, just didn't game at all. Whereas I can foresee myself as a 40-year-old gaming for sure. Benzoexazine asks, hopefully I've got that right, not including entry-level GPUs and game optimization, things that we've already talked about. So what area of PC gaming do you see has the most room for improvement?
Ooh, room for improvement. Okay, actually, first I was going to draw a blank, but no, something just jumped to me. Okay. So ease of use, especially as like a console alternative. So,
Mm,
um, For example, like if I have my 5090 and 9800 X3D and all that, but if I want to play it on my surround sound on my big TV, sit on the couch, that is so much more cumbersome than it is with like a PS5. PS5, I could have been playing a game a week ago and just like suspended it. Now I just hit one button, the whole system turns
Yeah,
on.
that's
The
nice.
game, I didn't even have to be at a save point or in a game that had saves. Like it just resumes where it was and it works. It just works simply and quickly. And as speaking of somebody with not a whole lot of free time, if I have to start as soon as you start having okay, I have to log in. And now speaking of like trying to get surround sound to work nicely, like for some reason, the same PC will just suddenly in Windows just not being set up for surround sound. Now it's stereo. Now I have to try to open up the menu to configure that. And they somehow in Windows 11 at some point removed the menu where it was easy to do. So now I have to use some like command
Hmm.
prompt to like pop open an older menu that they're trying to hide from me where I can do this. And then now I have to start up the game and it doesn't just resume right where I was. There's all these splash screens I need to skip through. And by the time I've done all of that, it's like, my limited gaming time I had is gone. Whereas like my Steam Deck has shown me that like that is a gaming PC. It's a Linux gaming PC on SteamOS, but hey, I can just hit the resume button. I'm right back into my game, just like I was on a PS5. It just works. It functions well in that environment. So I think that I think Windows could be a lot more gaming friendly, and I think we've seen some news regarding their potential like Xbox handheld or something, where maybe they're trying to push things into that direction. I would like it if you could have a gaming PC essentially function with all of the convenience and compatibility and game resume and sleep of what consoles are capable of doing, but still have a high-end gaming PC, right? That would be the dream. And I don't. It's just Windows is not there, and I hope it will improve.
I guess it's one of those big innovations they introduced with that generation of consoles, like the latest generation. Not only did they bring in an SSD, which allowed them to just load games much faster, but that whole like sleep and resume thing is very new. Certainly wasn't something that the PS4 could do. And that's something that, over time you always see with PCs versus consoles. The PC, as it gets later in the generation, is able to outperform what the consoles can do. They can use higher graphical effects and stuff like that. But what we haven't seen is that, as you were talking about, that resume sort of ease of access, getting into games quickly sort of feature come to PCs. Because, while you can also pause your console and resume it and do all that sort of thing, it's also very quick to load between games on a PS5. Like if you just open a game, you're almost right in that game from the menu, browsing around doing other things, you're just straight back into the action. Whereas on PC, there's a lot of let's look at the splash screens. Let's then go to the menu where you have to click load back into the game of where you're at. It's like your PC has fully deleted that game from its memory and has to load absolutely everything back in the next time you want to load it. Whereas consoles are still at the forefront of that ease of getting back to doing what you wanted to do in the game. And there are some games where, I think Indiana Jones does load into the game while you're seeing those splash screens. So as soon as you hit continue, you're straight in the game. I think Dead Space is another title that does something similar to that. But we're still in that very old school PC games. You have to click load, wait for the splash screens, get to the menu, load the save you want to load, then you're in a game, and that slows things down. So I guess it is a multi-purpose sort of device, right? It has to do different things on it. But for people that are getting more into, as you're talking about PC gaming becoming more mainstream, it needs those mainstream ease of life features, something that Microsoft seems to be kind of going the other direction. Like let's add more bloat and more unnecessary features and AI, as opposed to really harnessing what is a big gaming platform and making it, they've had game modes and things like that to try and do some of this, but it's never really been something that we see from like a Steam OS, because I have a Steam Deck as well. It's great for that sort of thing on the go. Um, the final question I want to ask is from Muddy. Daniel, how easy is it to deal with online nonsense criticism? Do you often feel forced to adapt your content to clear misunderstandings?
Oh man. Yeah, so certainly the one of the hardest parts of starting the YouTube channel is reading the comment section. And I think I just have to frame if you look at the view count on a video And then you look at the like 3 negative comments, or however many
Mm.
it was. It's like you have to understand that, you know, should I really be that upset or take it so personally? With if it's really like it's very clear that the vast majority of people watching the video were happy with it. Now that being said, I mean, okay, this is asking about nonsense criticism. I mean, like, I am open to constructive criticism. I have taken things from comments I've seen on my channel that were like, hey, you should have done this differently. I'm like, hey, yeah, I should have done that differently. Maybe I'll do that next time. So you can try to actually look into, the criticism and ask yourself, is this nonsense? Is this actually valid? Maybe I should change something. But yeah, there is a lot of nonsense criticism out there. So I don't feel forced to adapt my content to do that. If I deem it to be nonsense. But I'm open to adapting to legitimate, feedback, we could call it. Now, to clear misunderstandings, they might be referring to, I have done a number of videos where I begin the video presenting a comment that I've received on another video, and I'm addressing whatever that comment brought up. I've just used that as, like, honestly, I'll read the comment section and I'll see something and I'm about to type out some wall of text and I'm like, why don't I just record what I'm about to say? Because then I get a video out of it, and
Yeah, nice.
it's clearly some misunderstanding that I could help people understand. So I will say that maybe if that's what they're referring to, let's call that's just an opportunity. I can
Mhm.
vent my wall of text in video format and get some content out of it, and hopefully somebody learns something along the way.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we've seen over doing hardware unbox for however many years now is there's often things that we try and cover all sorts of different bases. Like we sort of try and understand how is the viewer coming into this video, how are they going to understand what we're presenting, and we think of 7 or 8 different things, ways. We'll try to close off some of the comments, some of the like the frequently asked questions sort of things. We'll try address in the conclusion of the video, for example. But then there's often things that we just totally miss, and that comments will bring up, or they have a different perspective that we haven't thought of. And even going back to what you were talking about earlier with some of the marketing side of things, where we have our audience of enthusiast gamers, but sometimes the content goes to a broader audience. Like it just happens to maybe go a bit more viral than we're used to, which for us is maybe just a few 100,000 views, not like a Mr. Beast video or anything, but it goes to that more mainstream audience, and they come with a completely different perspective to the videos. And so sometimes you need to address, or we found we've had to address things that maybe our audience is quite familiar with and thinks is sort of a more commonly understood topic. Like I remember when I was making a video for Monitors Unbox, it was how to set up your monitor. And some of the things were obviously tips and tricks that I've learned from testing so many displays that I think people could utilize. But then I included some very basic information, things like make sure to set your refresh rate to the maximum refresh, because often when you hook up a monitor for the first time, it's stuck at 60 hertz. And what resonated the most with people watching that video was that advice, was people going, hey, I'm sharing this content with my friends because I didn't know that you had to set your monitor to the highest refresh rate. I bought a monitor and I just thought it did that by default, which is a fair opinion to have. That's probably how it should work. But I changed that setting and my life is improved now because they're actually getting the benefit they paid for. And they're saying, like, I'm very confident none of my friends have done that either. And so, yeah, that's sort of the things I think the comments have been really good for. Like, even though obviously both of our channels do get negative comments, and sometimes on Reddit as well, places like that. But it does, if you can strip back the strong negativity sometimes, if you can understand where those alternate perspectives are coming from and sort of the position that they're in, then maybe you could use that in a future video to sort of, strengthen the conclusion, really address all the points that someone may have different perspectives and that sort of thing. So not all negative comments are bad. Obviously, there's lots of nonsense stuff that just makes no sense. And you're saying you make videos about that. These days, Steve found this like AI comment response feature. Like, it wasn't built into YouTube. It's like a third-party thing. We don't use AI at all really for videos, but it's very funny to just give people walls of text that are generated by AI to respond to people's nonsense. It sort of keeps them occupied. And sometimes it can even diffuse those comments. Like, they'll start out very angry, but then we'll use the AI in its like extremely polite mode. Like, you just type in respond to this comment super polite, and then it responds in this way that sort of diffuses it. And so that's kind of fun. But aside from that, it's just kind of the life of YouTube. You get used to it over time and yeah, just go from there.
Yeah.
Well, I think that'll do it for this episode of the Hardware Unboxed podcast. A big thanks to Daniel Owen for coming on board. We haven't had too many guests on the channel over time, so I think you're the maybe fourth or fifth that's ever come on. So as I mentioned to you before we jumped on, a highly requested guest from people, and I think people are going to really thoroughly enjoy this episode. If you haven't watched Daniel Owen's content at any point before, strongly encourage you to go over and subscribe to his channel, which is just called Daniel Owen. So you can search for that on YouTube. You'll find it very easily. And yeah, outside of that, we have the Hardware Unboxed podcast supporter feed. If you become a Patreon member for us, you sign up, you gain access to sort of an ad-free version of this podcast, a bunch of other stuff you get access to when you're a Patreon member as well, our Discord community. The comments and questions that we got for this episode were from our Discord community. So we asked in our podcast channel in there. That's another perk you get for being a Patreon member. And outside of that, thanks for watching, listening to this episode, and we'll see you in the next one.
Thanks for having me.